Hey guys, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 32 called Dinner Preparations. And the grammar concept we're coming back to is passive voice. So I know in chapter 30 we looked at passive voice, but we only looked at three tenses, present, imperfect, and future. And in chapter 31 we looked at how we use passive infinitives. Now we're coming back to the passive voice and you're going to learn how to do the last three tenses, pluperfect, perfect, and future perfect. To start though, let's take a look at some derivatives. So the first word we want to look at is invitati erant, which means they had been invited. And the word we're really after here is invitati, which is where we get invite or invitation in English. Next, we have panis, which means bread. Now this is where we get the word pantry in English, but it's also where we get the word for bread in basically all the Romance languages. So if you look on the left at the words in red, you're going to notice these words for bread all coming from the same place. Next, we have ovum, which means egg in Latin. And in English, we get words like oval and ovary. So again, an oval is an egg shape, right? An ovary, obviously from biology class, is where eggs are stored. They're coming from this same root. So next we have circum, which means around in Latin. And in English, we get a lot of derivatives that start with this prefix of circum, and it means the same thing, around. So you get words like circumnavigate, circumscribe, circumspect, circumference. They're all having to do with looking or writing or navigating around something. Next, we have the word regnum, which means kingdom. Now, this is related to rex and regina, which means king and queen in Latin. So regnum is the reign, the rule, the kingdom that a king has. And it's actually where we get the word reign from, and even interregnum, which is a Latin word that we use in English. Next, we have inferi, which is the underworld. And one thing you want to notice is that this is a plural word, so it's inferi instead of inferus. Even though in English we translate it underworld, it's a plural word in Latin. But this is where we get infernal from. Next we have oleum, which means oil in Latin. And we get a few words in English that have that same idea of oil. So for instance, petroleum, even the word oil, and linoleum is another good one, linseed oil. They all have this idea of oil involved in them. Next we have stratum in Latin, which means sheet or covering. And in English we get words like stratosphere, stratify, stratification. They all have to do with a sheet or a layer of something, really. So if you think, for instance, of the stratosphere, it's a layer of, Earth's atmosphere, right? Same thing with stratify. It has to do with a layer, or in this case, we're talking about a sheet in our story, but it's all from the same root. Next we have ignis, which means fire. And this is where we get words like ignite, ignition, and even igneous. If you think back to different types of rocks, igneous rocks are the ones that come from lava, right? Lava rocks are fire. They all have to do with the idea of a flame or a fire. Next, we have the verb cocore, which means to cook. And we've seen this before, but we have a lot of English words that come from it. So for instance, terracotta is that type of baked clay that you can build, houses out of if you want to. It literally means baked earth. Another good one is precocious. If you call someone precocious, it means they have this sort of pre-cooked or preconceived notions about people. Same thing with concoction. It's something you kind of make or cook up. They all have to do with this root of cooking. Next, we have the verb deicere, which in its active voice meaning would mean to throw down, but when you use it in the passive, it means to fall. This is where you get the word dejected in English. You can almost think of someone kind of hanging their head down. If they're dejected, they're feeling sad. It comes from this root. Next, we have effundere, which in the active voice means to pour out. In the passive voice, it means to be spilled or to spill. This is where in English we get the word effusive, which if you call someone that, it means they're kind of pouring out all their emotions. It's almost like gushing in a way. And it comes from that idea of pouring out without any sort of restraint or restriction. Next, we have solea, which are sandals, right? And this is where we get the word sole in English. Think of the sole of a shoe. It's basically a sandal. So now we want to go on to the grammar, and like I said, we're returning to passive voice, but this time we're looking at the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect tenses. And you're going to see it's pretty different from what we learned about present, imperfect, and future, so that's why we're putting it into a separate chapter. The first thing we want to do, though, is just do a quick review of the passive voice. So you want to remember, back in chapter 30, we said that passive voice verbs are used when the subject isn't doing anything, but something's being done to the subject. So for instance, you might say, canis a me ambulabator, which means the dog was being walked by me. The verb here, ambulabator, is passive, right? It has that tur ending, and that's where we get the translation, was being walked. The person doing the action in this case is, remember that ablative of agent, a me means by me. I, or in this case me, is the person or thing doing the action. So in this sentence, the dog isn't doing anything, something's happening to the dog. That's the general idea of how passive voice works. And like I said, we've only worked with the present, imperfect, and future tenses. And the reason we did this is because these are what we call the present system. And we've talked about this a little bit before, but they all start the same way. We go to the infinitive, we drop the RE, and that's how we get our conjugation going. So they all start with that present stem. In this chapter, you're going to learn that the next three tenses, perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, they're part of what we call the perfect system. And they all start the same way too, but it doesn't have anything to do with the infinitive. So to start, we want to just do a quick review of the four principal parts of Latin verbs. And by this point, you should be pretty comfortable with this because we've seen them for a while now. But you want to remember that all Latin verbs, well not all, but most Latin verbs have four parts that give us really important information. So for instance, I gave you here ambulo, ambulare, which means to walk. Now the first piece we're looking at, ambulo, that's the first person singular, present tense, active voice. It's how we say I walk. Ambulare, the second principal part, is the present active infinitive. It means to walk. Ambulavi is the third principal part. It's the first person singular in the perfect tense, active voice. So ambulo and ambulavi are pretty much related to each other. It's just one is present tense and one is perfect. The fourth principal part, which we're going to learn more about as we go in the next couple chapters, is what we call the perfect passive participle. It's a verbal adjective. We're going to be using it this chapter, but we're really going to dive in the next few chapters on what its uses are when it's not part of passive voice in the perfect, pluperfect, or future perfect tenses. For right now, just think of it as something we use for these three tenses when we use passive voice. So like I mentioned before, for all three of these tenses, we use the fourth principal part. That's where we start. And that's, again, the perfect passive participle. You're going to see this is a form of a verb that has adjective endings, specifically first and second declension adjective endings. So us, a, that's why we call it a verbal adjective. But again, don't get too bogged down on how we use it or what it means. We're going to be looking more into it in a couple of chapters on how it's used on its own. For right now, we're just using it in this one specific instance. So here's an example of the perfect tense in the passive voice, and I want you to pay attention. What type of things do you notice here? We have triclinium paratum est, which means the dining room was prepared. Now the verb here is actually two different pieces. It's paratum est, it's not one word. This is the perfect tense passive voice. And you're going to notice that we have paratum, which is a fourth principal part, and est, which is the verb to be in the present tense. So we want to think about what's going on here. So in the passive voice, the perfect tense is formed by taking that fourth principal part, just like we said, and you add on the present tense form of esse. So if you look down below, you're going to see three different examples of this. We have invitati sunt, which means the friends were invited, laudatis est, which is, the boy was praised, and portata est, the chest was carried. So at the end of these, you're going to see there's the present tense, sunt, est, and est. This is how we form the perfect tense in the passive voice. So you don't want to get confused because this verb, invitati sunt, in the first sentence, it's perfect tense, but it's using a form of esse that's in the present tense. So it gets a little confusing, so you want to just kind of keep that straight in your mind. And you're going to see the word right in front of the verb to be is the fourth principal part, invitati, laudatis, and portata. So let's take a look at this first sentence, right? Amici invitati sunt, the friends were invited. Like I said, invitati is the fourth principal part. It comes from invito, invitare, which means to invite, right? So that fourth principal part is in red, invitatus. That's where we got it from. The second word is the present tense form of esse, right? So that's why we have sunt. And we're going to dive a little bit into why these endings and why these words are spelled the way they are in another slide. So the important note you want to get is that the fourth principal part has adjective endings. Like we said, those first and second declension adjective endings, us, a, for masculine, feminine, and neuter. And since it has adjective endings, you have to remember that it's going to match the subject of the verb in case, number, and gender. So if we go back to that example sentence, or the three of them we were looking at, they're all doing the same thing. The fourth principal part is matching the subject. So here I have them highlighted. In that first sentence, invitati is matching amici. That's why they have the same ending. In the second one, laudatus is matching puer. They're both nominative, singular, masculine. And in the third one, portata is matching quista. They're both feminine, nominative, singular. This is what I mean by matching. You have to get that fourth principal part to match with the subject. So just pay attention to what your subject is every time you're using these. The other thing that you want to notice is that the form of esse depends on the subject. So again, here are those three sentences we were looking at. Now we looked at the fourth principal part, but let me highlight the verb to be. In the first sentence, it's sunt. Sunt is matching amici. You're saying the friends were invited. So amici is third person plural. It's matching with sunt, which is also third person plural. Next, we have puer and est. Again, they match, third person singular. And in the third sentence, you have ego and sum, first person singular. So you have to pay attention. Both pieces, right, the fourth principal part and the verb to be, they have to match with your subject. So now let's move on to the pluperfect tense. Let's pay attention here. What do we notice about these? It's the same idea, but you're going to notice in this sentence we have triclinium paratum erat. What did we change? We changed the verb to be. So there we have our pluperfect tense, passive voice verb, paratum erat, and it's been changed to had been prepared. So again, in the passive voice, the pluperfect tense, we form it by taking the fourth principal part, but instead of the perfect tense of esse, we use the imperfect tense of esse. And I've highlighted them here. We have erant, erat, erat. This is the difference between perfect tense, which originally was sunt, est. Now we have the imperfect tense, erant, erat, erat, and we've changed the meaning around. And pay attention to how we translate it too. It's had been invited, had been praised, had been carried. And again, the fourth principal part and the verb to be are both matching with our subject. So now we want to come back and look at future perfect tense. Again, what do we notice here? It's the same sentence, but now we have triclinium paratum erit. What do we change? We change the verb to be. So now you notice the verb to be has changed to future tense, erit. So paratum erit is the fourth principal part with the future tense of esse attached to it. This is how we form the future perfect tense in the passive voice. And pay attention to how we change the translation. Now it's will have been prepared. So again, here's those notes and the three examples. Every single one, we've changed the verb esse to be to make it future tense. And by doing that, by sticking it with the fourth principal part, we now have the future perfect tense in the passive voice. So again, here they are highlighted. We have erunt, eret, eret. And again, notice those translations one more time. It's the friends will have been invited, the boy will have been praised, and the chest will have been carried. So let's just do a quick recap of everything we learned. For the perfect tense, pluperfect tense, and future perfect tense, in the passive voice, they all start with the fourth principal part of our verb. So the exact same way. The difference between them is what we do with the verb esse. If we have the present tense of esse, that's the perfect tense passive voice. If we have the imperfect tense of esse with that fourth principal part, now we have the pluperfect tense in the passive voice. And if we have the future tense of esse with the fourth principal part, we now have the future perfect tense passive voice. And you want to think about translations for all of these in English. The perfect tense, we translate was or has been, right? For the pluperfect tense, we translate it had been. And for the future perfect tense, we translate it will have been. This will help you keep all of them straight in your mind. So here's another quick recap of all these tenses in one chart. And you want to pay attention to the fourth principal part and the verb to be. So you'll notice that all three of these tenses start with portatus a And remember, that's the masculine, feminine, and neuter form. It's using adjective endings on that fourth principal part. And in the plural, you want to notice that we've just pluralized it. So you have e, I, a. The other thing to keep track of is the verb to be. If it's present tense, so sum es est, you're talking about perfect passive. If it's imperfect tense, eram, eras, erat, you're talking about the pluperfect passive. And if it's future tense, ero, eris, erit, you're talking about the future perfect passive. So I know this gets a little tricky, a little complicated. The first thing I would recommend you do, make sure you have all the forms of esse memorized. And then you want to start working with those fourth principal parts. You want to remember, they have to match your subject in case, number, and gender. It'll click with enough practice. You just have to think a little critically about it because this is different from what we did with present, imperfect, and future tense.